Thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Good evening. Thanks for the invite.
I welcome you to the show. Oh, your hands are so nice and warm. I was still a little cold from outside.
You are.
Tell me about the budgetary cuts that have affected your police department.
Well, like every municipality across California and every police department across California, we've all experienced budget cuts that have caused significant service reductions or staffing shortages. And for 4 consecutive years, the city of Modesto has obviously experienced a revenue shortfall. And so we've been tasked as department heads to come up with a strategy by which we can meet those demands. And so unfortunately, the police department's eliminated about 25% of its staffing over the last 4 years, full-time staffing. That is both sworn officers, police officers that you see in uniform, and support personnel, some of the personnel that work behind the scenes that you don't really see too much and you don't really think of when you think of the police department, but about 100 full-time employees have been eliminated, largely through attrition. As somebody has separated from the department, retired or resigned, sought employment somewhere else, we haven't backfilled the vacancy, and we've grown that attrition to about 100 full-time positions. About $10.5 million has been eliminated from the police department budget over the last 4 years. So quite naturally, we are experiencing some challenges. We know that annually there's going to be about 120,000 calls for service that citizens in our community want to be served from A to Z, from the motor vehicle traffic collision to the homicide investigation. And we're still trying to fit those 120,000 calls amongst 100 fewer employees, and it's become increasingly difficult to do so. So naturally, we've had to cut back on some of our services that we've provided that we'd like to provide, but we just can't. We've tried a differential response with some of our calls that are reported that are of a non-threatening manner. It goes in the call queue and may wait for some time until we can get an officer who can respond. So it's been a challenge. There's no question. I love the police department. I grew up there. I started as an Explorer Scout in the late 70s, and I've been a full-time employee since for almost 28 years. And I love the police department. I love Modesto. I've lived here since 1970. I love the opportunity to run the police department. I just wish that the timing had been a little bit better, where I didn't have to face these difficult fiscal challenges. But nonetheless, crime is down in Modesto. Reported crime is down in Modesto in spite of our staffing reductions. And I think that's largely because of the work of the men and women of the department, but also because of the community.
You said you get about 120,000 calls a year. There's about 220,000 people in Modesto. That sounds like about half the people are calling you all the time.
Right. Well, there probably is, to some extent, in law enforcement, the 90-10 principle or the 20-80 principle, and that is probably that only 20% or maybe only 10% of our population create 90% or 80% of the work. We do come into contact with people who report who are involved in criminal conduct time and time again. So we don't really interact with the vast majority of our community in that way. But certainly when you call 911 and you see something that's odd or peculiar in your neighborhood, or you're involved in a theft of some situation or some act of violence, whatever the case may be, and you make a 911 call, you want a response. And so our challenge has been staffing. Our challenge has been officers have to train. They have to vacation with their families, and trying to fit all this into a staffing pattern that's got 100 fewer employees is increasingly difficult to do so. But we don't interact with the vast majority of our community, because the vast majority of our community are very law-abiding, hard-working individuals who do the same thing that you and I do every single day. We do interact with frequent flyers, so to speak, people who call on our services far too often and far too frequent, but nonetheless, that's what we're here to do.
You know, off topic just for a minute, you mentioned 911 calls. So many people now have cell phones. What do we do when we call 911 on our cell phone? Does that go to the CHP, or does it go to Modesto Police Department?
There are some 911 cell phone providers that still rings at CHP dispatch.
Okay.
There are other cell providers that ring at the local, at our Stanislaus Regional 911. The most important message for people to understand is, if you can't remember a number, dial 911. If it goes to CHP, they'll quickly transfer to Stanislaus Regional. You'll lose just a couple of seconds. But if you want to program it into your phone, it's 558-HELP, 558-HELP on your cell phone. Because if you don't know if your cell provider is one that rings at dispatch or CHP. But nonetheless, the most important thing is, if it feels like an emergency to you, call 911. I get that question a lot. Well, what's an emergency? What's not? Not for me to decide. It's for you to decide. If it feels like an emergency to you, if it feels like you need a police response, don't quibble over what
Right.
number it is. Just call 911 and we'll sort it out. So absolutely.
Back to the budget, how do you feel that the budget has affected the service to the community? Being out in the community, it seems like if there's less money and there's less officers, the service has gone down. Do you find that to be true, or do you think that the service is still a quality that it has been?
Well, I'm happy to report that I think if you're the victim of a crime or you call 911 for an emergency, you're still going to get a very swift response by the Modesto Police Department. We intake all of our calls to the 911 center, and we prioritize those calls. Based upon the seriousness of what's been reported, the threat to public safety, staffing availability, we put those calls in levels. If it's a level 1P, we respond, and we're very good at having a call arrive at dispatch, first officer on scene, within about 5 minutes for an in-progress type of call. Where we've seen the slippage is some of the non-hazardous calls. The person who calls in and says the bike was stolen from their front yard, or if they were involved in a motor vehicle collision where there were no injuries and everybody's licensed and insured and no one's DUI and the roadway's not blocked and there's no need for a tow truck. And that might, be a slow response. We might encourage the people who are involved to exchange names only and not do an investigation. We've closed the lobby at the police department on weekends. We've brought on an online crime reporting feature, so individuals who are the victim of a crime or want to report criminal activity, they can do it online. So we've had to adjust, no question, because of our staffing issues, but I'm very happy to report that if there's an emergency in our community and someone calls 911, then we can respond quickly. To the in-progress emergency type of situation, a little less so if it's not a threat, immediate threat, there's no one who's being injured or those kinds of things. But it's just it's a challenge every day based upon our staffing and the call volume. And there's really no rhyme or reason. There's no predictability with our call volume. Sometimes we find Saturdays are off the hook, so to speak, and for whatever reason, a Tuesday evening might be. So, we have to staff accordingly. We bring on several shifts a day, try to bring enough officers on duty and stagger the shifts so they stay in front of the call volume. We can stay on top of the call volume. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we have a large emerging issue in our community, maybe a large gang fight or something along those lines, and we'll go into condition yellow. Condition yellow is where the police department is only taking in-progress calls. And so if you call in and say, my home was burglarized and we're in condition yellow at the Modesto Police Department, we'll notify the caller that we're not going to come, we can't come at this point because of this emerging issue, whatever the case may be. And I've lived in Modesto since 1970. I've seen lots of changes in the community, lots of changes at the police department, of course. I believe that's the level of service our community expects. They just want to be told and informed. And when you're left to your own devices to draw your own conclusions, sometimes it looks and it appears as if we're uncaring and we don't care. And nothing could be farther from the truth. We absolutely care about this community. I get to see and interact with 300 full-time employees who care deeply about the community. It's just that they're very busy. They have a lot of work to do. And sometimes we're able to meet and exceed the expectations of our community. Sometimes, unfortunately, we come up a little short, but that's when we have to communicate to our community. These are the reasons why.
A minute ago, you mentioned that we can file a report online. Do we just go to the Modesto Police Department website and there's a link there?
Correct, www.modestopolice.com. There's an online link for online crime reporting, and a citizen can report. And I would ask that they probably should do that when there's a very low probability of a crime being solved. There's no suspect information, there's no witnesses, and there's no evidence. An example might be, for insurance purposes, they're reporting that the unlocked car in front of the house was broken into and the car stereo was taken. I mean, certainly that's a concern of ours. We need to have that crime reported so we can gather the data and find out where the problems are. If it's not reported, we're left to our own conclusions that, boy, it must not have happened. But it allows us to deploy our resources more effectively when we know where certain crimes are occurring. But the probability, frankly, of that being solved is very remote. There's no evidence that will link up that crime with the suspect. It probably is not a wise use of resources to send an officer to say, yep, your car was broken into, the window was smashed. Maybe it's just more judicious for us to report it online, allow us to gather the data, allow us to now deploy our resources in the future, knowing that there's a certain crime hotspot, those kinds of things. So just go to the police website and self-report, and we'll be happy to take the information.
Speaking of hotspots where there may be more crime, do you gather that data and then you organize task force? Is that part of your John?
Absolutely. We have a crime analysis unit that tracks all reported crime in our community: vehicle burglaries, commercial burglaries, residential burglaries, auto thefts, where they're recovered, robberies, so on and so forth. And based upon those dots, if you will, on a map, we deploy our resources. And so we start to see a trend in this particular area, then we'll flood that particular area with officers. Or in this particular area, then we'll do that. So that happens daily and weekly at the police department. One thing I want to mention, in the next 2 weeks or so, we'll distribute that crime information via our website. So citizens who want to know, what's my neighborhood look like,
Right.
can go to our website. It's real-time data, and it'll show burglaries and assaults and those kinds of things. Everybody wonders, boy, there's a lot of police activity down the street. I wonder what that was. And sometimes it could be something very serious. Sometimes it could be nothing at all. But now citizens will be able to go on and find that dot on their map. It won't identify the exact address, but
Sure.
it will be a 100 block. And citizens will know. We hope to bring that technology on here in the next 2 weeks.
Is that part of your doing since you've been a police chief?
Well, it's technology that was emerging, but I think an informed community is an armed community, so to speak. And many years ago, law enforcement was very they weren't very transparent. They would keep all the information and share it with amongst themselves, and they felt as if it was giving information out to the community was going to somehow tip off a crook or something along those lines. There's been an absolute sea change with respect to that. And now I believe, and other police chiefs believe, that arming the community with as much information as they can get their hands on is an informed community. So I have no problem sharing crime data with the community where particular crimes are happening. I have no problem opening up the police department to individuals about what we do and how we do it. I have no problem coming on a show like this and saying, we find ourselves in a difficult situation with 25% reduced staffing, but a call volume that still, is roughly 10,000 calls a month. So it's all about informing the community, explaining to them where we're at, how we got here, what we plan to do in the future. And I do believe that the use of technology is a force multiplier. And what I mean by that is, technology will never completely take the place of an officer, the boot on the ground. But it can aid our community in knowing what's going on, when it happened, how it happened, why it happened, and then arming themselves, hopefully to protect themselves from becoming victims in the future. There is probably an over-reliance in every community, I think, on 911. A number of citizens think, my job is just to call 911, report something that's a foul, and that's it. Our community's civic sense of duty is really much more than that. It is absolutely being a neighborhood watch captain, being active involved in neighborhood watch. It's not just simply reporting, but continuing to watch and then cooperating with law enforcement to provide a description or, if you know the person, actually identifying a suspect, if you will. The community wants a safe city. Naturally, as the police chief, I want a safe city. I can't do it. Our officers can't do it by themselves, and citizens cannot get there by themselves. Working in a symbiotic relationship, knowing that we need each other, it's a trust thing. I think we'll get to the point where we'll realize that the city is as safe as it can be. But it absolutely is a partnership. Without it, we're probably doomed for failure. But working together, we can make some great strides. I'm very confident of that.
Talking about more eyes watching the neighborhood, what do you think of private security being brought into various neighborhoods within Modesto?
I certainly have no objections to it because it kind of it's an extension of what I previously mentioned. It's neighbors saying we're not in this game by ourselves, and law enforcement's not in this game by themselves. We have to find unique strategies to get to a desired location, to get to a desired point in time. If that's the use of private security, who are hired by a neighborhood group, who are hired by a business or whatever the case may be to watch out for the business, I'm all for it. I don't have enough officers to be in every neighborhood, to be on every street. And I would never acquiesce the law enforcement responsibility to private security. I mean, police officers have the responsibility to stop, interact with individuals, arrest individuals if the case merits, and private security does not. But I'm all about additional eyes and ears. See something suspicious, report to law enforcement. I have no objections to the use of private security. In fact, I would encourage it.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned about the boot on the ground. How do you see the income or loss thereof, or the staffing or the loss thereof, affecting the morale of the police officers and the staff that works within the police department?
Well, there's no question there's a price to pay. As I said, when you had more employees to spread the work out, then they weren't quite as exasperated as they are now. Frankly, from the minute an officer comes to work, and I say officer, that means a records clerk as well. It could be a dispatcher. It could be a community service officer. From the time they come to work till the time their shift is over, they're very active. And now you throw in they want a vacation, like we all do, and then that creates a staffing challenge, or we have to train. That creates a staffing challenge. So, but I have a strong leadership team, and I have a cadre of officers and support personnel who know what the mission is. I mean, no one put a gun to our head and said, go do this. We all willingly put up our right hand and took an oath of office and said, I'm here to serve. And so, while morale, from time to time is obviously impacted by our staffing issues, every employee gets the larger picture, and that is that we're here to serve. We're here to provide a service to our community and to try to keep it as safe as we can. And I'm very happy that Part 1 crime, that's crimes that are defined by the FBI as murder, burglary, assault, auto theft, rape, robbery, are down in Modesto by about 6%, and they were down about 5% the year before. That equates to about 750, 800 fewer crime victims annually.
That's quite a bit.
Absolutely. And so that's the macro level discussion. I mean, the numbers are the numbers. They're real. The micro level is I've still seen families impacted by crime, and one is one too many. The family who loses their only means of transportation, the family who's had their house broken into and Christmas gifts taken, or whatever the case may be. So the macro level, the numbers look good. The micro level, it's unfortunate. And that's why probably the best program we have going for us now is our crime prevention efforts. In spite of our staffing reductions, I've maintained a focus on crime prevention. If we can prevent crime from occurring in the first place, it's a far better investment than trying to investigate on the backside, which we know is going to be much more expensive. I'm not naive to think that will eliminate crime in its entirety, but if we can make crime less inviting, harden the target, so to speak, then the crook moves to the next location, to the next location, to the next location, and maybe eventually we can move them out of Modesto. That's why citizens need to know that they have a stake in this equation. Don't leave the laptop on the front seat of the car. Don't leave the cell phone. Don't leave the car unlocked. If you have a car, specifically a Honda, club it. Put a club up there. In the past, we've given away free clubs, and we'll do that again. It takes about 30 seconds to put a club on. Do those things because, when you're the victim of a crime, all those things will flood back, and you go, gosh, I should have done that. Just spend the extra 30 seconds, and we'll push them out of Modesto would be my preference. But we know we won't get rid of all the crooks, and so we'll keep the pressure on them. Our big thing is gang violence. That's huge right now because gang violence is indiscriminate. Gang members do control much of the drug trafficking in our city, in our community, in our state. But keeping them, knowing where the gang members live, who they associate with, what are their terms of probation or parole, those kinds of things, knowing if they commit an offense, what have you, they can be quickly apprehended. And so we keep an eye on the gang members quite heavily. And we've had too many gang homicides this year, but I'm happy to report that in 2010 we had 10 homicides. In 2011, 14. Even one is one too many, quite naturally. In 2009, we had 23. And there's other cities in our area who have experienced some serious, significant gang violence in the community. And while, like I said, one homicide is one too many, we're very proud of our track record of trying to keep gang violence and violent crime in check.
A minute ago, you mentioned leadership. Do you have a task force or leadership program within the police department that goes out into the community? You mentioned at the beginning of the interview that you were an explorer. Do you have something? I know when my son was in school, they had the DARE program. Do you have something like that going on?
Well, unfortunately, we have a couple of programs, nothing along the lines of DARE. With our staffing shortages, trying to redeploy personnel, we've lowered 7 positions in our traffic unit. We used to have 18 traffic officers. We now have 11. We used to have 8 school police officers. We now have only 4 school police officers. So as I've tried to adjust the department to these staffing reductions, I redeployed personnel from those assignments to patrol, obviously, or to detectives. And so, no, we've seen a serious reduction in the nice-to-have program. So no, there is currently no DARE program. I do have 4 police officers who work in schools, at the high schools. We do have a very aggressive gang unit. We do have a school police officer who coordinates a lot of our junior traffic patrol and our wake-up program and those kinds of things. We have a very aggressive Explorer program. But unfortunately, some of the things that we used to do, like having an officer at all the high schools and some of the middle schools and the DARE program or the GREAT program, have gone by the wayside because of the staffing reductions. I mean, it's not something that I wouldn't do if we didn't have additional staffing and funding, but just trying to redeploy the personnel. Some of the things have to slip, if you will, and those are the things that have to slip, unfortunately.
You were talking about prevention. Do you see any long-term effects of, like, the DARE program? I know it impacted my son greatly to a positive end for him. It started, I think, in grade 5, actually. Do you have any statistics about how those programs have impacted what now are the 25 to 35-year-olds?
I don't have the statistics, but I do know that there are proponents who fall out on both sides of the issue. There are some, and I've seen some research that has said that DARE was not successful. I don't know whether it was or was not. And I've seen some research that says it absolutely was. You know, you'd almost have to take a large body and do some longitudinal research, get them 10 years later, you know, have you stayed off drugs, have you remained drug-free, and if so, why? You know, then you'd have to find out, well, it was the DARE instruction I had, or was perhaps the upbringing I had with mom, or mom and dad, or grandma and grandpa, whatever the case may be. So I've only seen the research that makes a case for both sides of the discussion. I don't know where it falls out, but you know, we have our Wake Up program right now, which is our strongest outreach effort, and that's a program that targets minor children who aren't yet in the system, so to speak. They aren't wards of the court. They have not committed criminal conduct, or if they have, it's been a very minor offense. And it's a 10-week course that's required of the child, but also a parent to attend. And every week has a specific topic. And there's got a scared straight component, there's a truancy component, a drug component, and those kinds of things. And I do know that from anecdotally the comments that I get from both parents and those kids who attend, that it's hugely successful. It's turned many lives around. So that's really our flagship program up to this point in terms of prevention efforts and in terms of minors. But we also have applied for some grant funding to continue some of our anti-gang violence strategies. In the past, we've had a carrot and stick program where we would target gang members who we know are committing violence in our community, come into a call-in, and at the call-in they were told under no uncertain terms, we know who you are, we know where you live, we know what you drive, we know who you associate with, the violence must stop. And if today you're going to be given a terrific opportunity to accept some services that are going to be provided for you, and from GED completion to tattoo removal to whatever the resume development, or if you continue in the life of violence, really there's only two logical conclusions, unfortunately, and that is incarceration or death, of course, because we know that being involved in a gang is a risky proposition, and it follows the Operation Ceasefire, which was very popular in Boston and Chicago. And we've seen some significant reductions in gang violence. Unfortunately, that program ended because we ran out of funding, but we've recently reapplied for additional grant funding through the state of California. I hope to receive that, and if we do, then we can institute it again. Because I do think, and you've heard chiefs, I've heard chiefs, I've said it myself, we're not going to be able to arrest our way completely out of the gang problem. It really is going to be a layered approach from education, intervention, prevention. I think we can make some headway. But much of the gang membership in California is entrenched, it's generational, and it's going to take some time to make some headway. There's no question about it.
In conclusion, what can we do as residents of Modesto to assist the police department?
Well, I think first and foremost is join a neighborhood watch. It's absolutely critical. It gives us an opportunity, if you call about something suspicious in the neighborhood, to find out why the blue Chevrolet or why the red Ford pickup is in there. Maybe it's perfectly legitimate, and that's okay. But if it's not, it'll send a strong message that this particular neighborhood does not tolerate, something that's a foul, something that just doesn't seem right. And if we have the ability to interact with that individual who's been called upon, perhaps we can find out if they're on what they're doing in the neighborhood, probation, parole, what have you. Say they're doing something that's not quite criminal, at least they'll know that neighborhood's being watched, and they'll go to some other neighborhood. The biggest thing is be a good witness, get involved, help us out when you can, know where your children are at, what they're doing. I'm not into giving parental advice. I am a father of 2 children. I hear it all the time. I can't go into my child's room. I can't look in my child's backpack. You absolutely can do that. Parents need to be parents and not necessarily just a good friend.
Right.
They need to know, where my children are at, who they're associating with, what's in their backpack, what's on their cell phone, what's their internet use, those kinds of things. And when it's not consistent with something that the parent wishes, take some corrective action. But first and foremost, I would just tell the citizens, get involved, become a partner with us. We'll share as much information as we can with them in terms of crime in their neighborhood. And if there's not an active neighborhood watch program, join one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I appreciate you being my guest this evening.
Absolutely.